All right, I'm so excited for our next presentation. In fact, I'm so excited for the entire afternoon. I think we've got a jam-packed agenda here, and we'll have Mike Moffatt up at the podium here. I do want to hand things over to another one of our important sponsors here in a minute, and Brendan McGinty had me reminiscing about the Board of Trade going back so many, in fact, over a century, and was talking to Ian Sherman a few minutes ago about his family history going back decades. And when I think of, one of the families and companies that dates back for decades, that's been quite literally responsible for building many aspects of our city, I think about Regional Group. And for the old-timers in the audience, I don't think I'm an old-timer, but I still remember Len Peteshin being a big part of the Ottawa Board of Trade way back when. Shirley remembers. 3 cheers for Len. Great man that played a big role, right, Shirley, in the Board of Trade for so many years. So it is my distinct pleasure to welcome from the EQ Homes aspect of Regional Group. So EQ, of course, is a residential. They do many fantastic developments. The one on Main Street comes to mind. I was walking by it, in fact, down that street just maybe 2 weeks ago to have coffee with someone at the bridgehead there, and I was just marveling at the mixed use and how that Main Street development really is a model for a future of development in our city. But anyway, without further ado, let me introduce Josh Kardish from EQ Homes. Here he is.
Welcome, Josh. Thanks so much. So I'm super delighted to hear that you walk by the community. I'm disappointed you didn't come in and buy a condominium. And I'll get your contact information. Perfect, that's great. So my name is Josh Kardish. I'm with EQ Homes, which is the home building affiliate of the Regional Group. I think my role here today is just quickly introduce our organization and then connect the dots between what we do and what the first keynote speaker this afternoon does. So I'm going to just try and do this quickly in my head. For those of you that aren't familiar with Regional, and there are some younger people in the audience that may not be, Regional is a 60-plus-year-old family-run diversified real estate company here in Ottawa. It has slowly transitioned to its 3rd generation of family management. I am loosely affiliated with that family. Len is my great uncle and a source of pride for me when he still walks through the hallways at our organization. We found out on Monday that when you become a 3rd generation organization in the city, you are gifted a gold office building. That's a joke. For those of you that don't know, on Monday we closed on the acquisition of the old Corel headquarters on Carling. This is a massive milestone for our organization. I want to personally thank Sachin Anand, who's here today, who headed that acquisition. The connection between that and Mike is that as an organization, we have learned as a series of executives to really ply into economic data and to try and think differently about how we use our investors' money to make strategic real estate investments. And I know that this is something that Mike has done as he's come to connect the dots between economic analysis, municipal growth strategies, and housing affordability. I know for a fact, I know this personally because I've been following Mike's career, that he came to this because he encountered some issues on his own about housing affordability. And we go through these same exercises as an organization at Regional. I'm exceptionally proud to work at an organization that does a lot of things that are firsts in the home building industry. Many people may not remember this, but in the 1990s, Regional was the first organization to do housing conversions. We converted old townhouse stock into freehold ownership, and in doing so, allowed a lot of people to afford to buy their first home and build equity. In the early 2000s, after we started EQ Homes, we were the first production home builder in Canada to offer smart home technology as a standard in our homes. We were one of the first production home builders in Ottawa to go outside the municipal boundary and grow a community at scale, Equinel. And at the same time, we focused on building a very highly regarded and progressive community, Greystone in Ottawa East. We are diversified. We do a lot of very interesting and different things. On a personal note, and this relates, Mike, before I get into your biography, I'm just going to say this because I find this very inspirational. I happen to have a degree in finance and a master's in urban planning. And I have been personally frustrated for many years that we don't connect the dots between economics, finance, and planning when we make important land use policy and municipal growth discussions. I've been inspired to see Mike begin to do this, and I hope that Mike is just the beginning of the discussion where we connect the dots on these really important issues as we talk about municipal growth and affordable housing. So now, Mike, that's my personal note. Now I'm going to read your bio. It is now my pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker. Dr. Mike Moffatt is the founding director of the Place Center, the senior director of policy and innovation at the Smart Prosperity Institute, and an assistant professor in the Business Economics and Public Policy Area Group at Ivey Business School, Western University. Mike's work focuses on the nexus between regional economic development, innovation, housing, and climate policy. He has held previous research positions at the Moffatt Center, Lawrence Center, Canada 2020, and for the federal government, where he was Canada's first ever Chief Innovation Fellow. Mike holds a PhD in management science, and Mike, we can't wait to hear what you have to tell us today about all these issues. Welcome.
There you go. Well, welcome for having me here today. I'm really excited to be here. So, a few things that I think many of you heard me last year. So this is kind of an update on the things that I said last year. Some things have changed, a lot of things haven't. The first is that we have an exodus out of Ontario. We have a lot of people leaving Ontario. We have more people leaving Ontario to move to other provinces than are moving in the other direction. Good news is that's starting to slow down. Bad news is that's still quite elevated. And if we look at who's leaving, it's a lot of young families or young people about to have kids. So the potential here for talent attraction and retention is massive. You know, people are moving to cities, talent is moving to cities where they can afford to raise kids, afford to raise family. That can and should be Ottawa if we put those conditions in place. So one of the key messages that I'm always giving, because we do a lot of work on regional economic development, is if you're trying to attract 30-year-old workers, make your city a great place for 2-year-old children. All right, because that is the biggest driver of mobility right now in Canada. People, young professional couples going, where can I afford to raise a kid? You have a great city to raise kids, you're going to have a healthy economy. So we're kind of blessed today. It's kind of a sunny day, so I know this is a little bit hard to see. The blue line is the number of people moving to Ontario from other provinces, and the orange line is the number of people moving out of Ontario to somewhere else. We have seen since the beginning of the pandemic a massive rise in the number of people moving out of Ontario to other provinces. And where they're largely going, we can actually split about a third, a third, a third. A third of them are going to Alberta, a third of them are going to Atlantic Canada, and a third are going basically everywhere else. But the one thing that they have in common is almost entirely is that they're moving to cities where home prices are about half of the places that they're moving from. So Calgary, Edmonton, Moncton, Halifax, though a little less so Halifax these days because Halifax is getting quite expensive. And we can look at the age profile of people who are leaving. And generally speaking, people in their 20s are the most mobile. Or the two most common times or the two most common reasons to move from one province to another, the first is going to university and college, and then the second is graduating from university and college and getting your first job. Those are when people, in general, are most mobile. And if we look, the bulk of people leaving Ontario, the mass of people leaving Ontario, are over half of them are between the ages of 19 and 32. Those are half of the people who are leaving Ontario. We do see a little bit of a bump. We do see people in their 50s and 60s kind of cashing out. You know, it's like, okay, I live in the annex in Toronto and I'm going to cash out and buy big beachfront property in PEI. You see that happening. That is a real phenomenon. But the biggest source of migration by far, the biggest source of migration by far is young people who have either just had a child or about 2 to 3 years away from having their first child. Those are the people who are largely leaving Ontario. And I see it firsthand that I've taught fourth-year undergraduate at Ivy Business School for the last 16 to going on 17 years now. So basically, I've spent my last 17 years hanging out with 22 and 23-year-olds. I age, they don't. And 10 years ago, my students would go to wherever they, and this is a business school, I'd like to think, very good business school. They all come out of it with great jobs. 10 years ago, the decision they always made is, I want the best possible job when I graduate. Don't care where it is, what is the best possible job to set me off on career success? Today, my students often ask me, well, I have to choose. I could take this job in Toronto that sets me off for a nice career path, but I don't think I can afford to live there. I could take this other job in Edmonton, it doesn't have as much career potential, but I can actually afford some place to live. And it's changing their location decisions. So we do have a plan to counter this. Ontario has set up housing targets, supply targets for 50 different municipalities across the province. Here shown in green on the left-hand side of the target. So basically, what the province is telling the city of Ottawa to do is basically raise housing starts, which had traditionally been about 7,000 a year, to about 17,000. So I see some home builders and Jason and others, you guys got your work cut out for you. I'm going to suggest that this is necessary. And if we can do this, and do this in a way that we're not just creating units, but we're creating great communities for families with kids, we're going to create a healthy, vibrant Ottawa. But the challenge is, I think, evident from this graph, that we have this line that goes like this and goes up and down and then spikes up. As a spoiler, we're not going to get there under the current policy environment. We're not going to get there under current interest rates. We need some big things to change in order to get there. So this is a necessary goal, and if we got there, again, we'll have a great local economy, a great local community. But this is going to be a challenge. And we're already seeing stories across Ontario, not just in Ottawa, of slowdowns in housing starts, slowdowns in housing constructions. There was a piece in the Globe and Mail either yesterday or today about 60 condo projects in the GTA stalled. And we're hearing the same thing here in Ottawa, that things are just stalling out. And we see that in the last year, that we had fewer housing starts in 2023 than we had in 2022. So how do we fix this? So again, I just want to reiterate, because it's easy to say supply, 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 and I'm a numbers guy, and I like to have my Excel sheets or whatever, and people say, well, it's not just about creating units, and I totally agree, and I just want to make sure that this is well understood by this crowd, that building more homes is necessary, but it's not sufficient, that we need other family-friendly housing infrastructure like parks, like schools, like safe streets, and so on, but we need more units, and particularly we need more family-sized units. So the question becomes, okay, well, why can't we create them? Or why is new housing so expensive? Like, why can't we just build the homes that we did 20 years ago? So there's this group called Cancia that did a study, basically broke down the costs of building a home. This is Ontario data. I'm going to go through all of this, but I promise it's numbers, but I'll make it entertaining. At least I like to think I'll make it entertaining. Why is it so expensive to build? And basically, we can break this down into 4 components, and I'll go through each 4 of these. The first is all of the input costs other than labor. So that's land, that's materials, that's finance, that's services, all the stuff that actually goes into building the structure, the lot, and so on. That's in purple. In orange is worker salaries and benefits, and by that we actually mean the trades workers. So your electricians, your plumbers, your sheet metal workers, and so on. Green is profits, That's the profits of your builders, profits of your developers, profits of your suppliers, and so on. And 4 different shades of blue representing 4 different types of taxes. Things like development charges, sales taxes, land transfer taxes, and so on. This graph here is just average for Ontario for single detached homes. Those proportions are going to change depending on what and where we're building. So those proportions will change if we're looking at apartments. Those proportions will be different in Ottawa than in Toronto, than in my hometown of London, and so on. But those are the 4 big areas that are basically driving costs. So any policy discussion, I think, has to surgically look at those one by one by one by one. And that's a lot of what we do at the Place Center is, not just advocate for policy's sake, but really take a surgical approach and go, okay, well, what are all of those input costs? And how do we deal with each of those? But in a way that we're still creating great communities, in a way that we're still protecting the environment, that we're making homes that are resilient to extreme weather events and so on. But we need strategies to deal with all of these. Because the middle class is just never going to be able to afford, again, we're looking at the average home. Right now, the average newly constructed average single detached home in Ontario is costing $940,000. Okay, let's apply the old rule of 3 to that, right? That you shouldn't be spending more than 3 times your family's pre-tax income on a home. There are not a lot of families in this province who are earning $313,000 in family income a year, right? There's just this massive disconnect between the cost of building new homes and what families earned. And we could kind of get away with that when interest rates were 1 or 2% and borrowing costs were really low. But now we've had a normalization of interest rates. This math doesn't work. And the homes aren't going to get built unless somebody is going to be able to pay for them, someone's going to be able to afford them. So how can we drive these costs down while at the same time doing all of those other things that we need to do? So we've had a couple big projects at the Place Center, and I won't dwell on them too much, but they're just here if you're interested. Last summer, a group of us, the Center, the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, and RealPAC, a group of investors, got together and put together a report called A Multi-Sector Approach to Ending Canada's Rental Housing Crisis. It was a series of recommendations for the federal government to attack the problem of a lack of affordability on the rental side. And a number of the recommendations have since made it in their way to federal policy. The other report just came out a couple months ago. It's called the Blueprint for More and Better Housing. It's put together by a group called the Task Force for Housing and Climate, all about how can we simultaneously address the housing crisis and the climate crisis. Put together by Don Iveson, the former mayor of Edmonton, and Lisa Raitt, the former Harbour-era Conservative cabinet minister, and a number of recommendations. In fact, 40 of the recommendations ended up getting announced, versions of them ended up getting announced by the federal government in the last month. But there's a lot more to do. So let's go through these one by one. So the biggest slice here, and again, this ratio will change depending on what and where we're building, but things like land, material, finance, and services. So if we go to land, my hometown of London, Ontario, where I bought my first home, land prices on new on greenfield sites are anywhere from 5 to 10 times higher today than they were 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I could buy my first home, and I did, newly constructed, 2-story, 3-bedroom home for $168,000. You can't even get the land for that now. Right? So we need policies to attack the price of land, make land more available, create more competition in the land market. So that's things like allowing for gentle as-of-right density on existing sites. That's for being able to build infill, build on parking lots, being able to build up in a gentle way that respects the needs of the community. The second is access to government-owned land, and we've seen the federal government announce that last week, with the focus on building on Canada Post sites and building on Department of National Defense sites, which are spread across the country. So if we make more government land available, again, that can help drive down the costs. But we also need sensible, transparent, sustainable, and fair processes to open up greenfield sites. That the discussion on urban growth boundaries has become so polarized and so challenging, where you've got different sides have dug themselves into this battle, where we need to have more sensible policies around that we need to protect farmlands. We need to make sure that we're not building on floodplains, but we also need to realize that a growing population requires places to live. And right now we don't have that. That our politics by land use has become so polarized, so difficult, that we need all three orders of government to work together, work with institutes like ours and others, to start having a grown-up conversation about where we build and how we build, and realize that we can't solve this just by one side saying, okay, no, we can never open up any land, and the other side going, okay, well, we'll just, you can have somebody in a government office just arbitrarily redrawing lines. Like, you just need a better process than that. Because one of the things that we're seeing, particularly in smaller communities, is not only is there a lack of available land, but oftentimes the land that is available, often all the land is owned by one or two or three groups. So not only do you have a shortage, but you also layer on top of that a lack of competition, which drives up prices even further. Which is, again, not a discussion that we seem to be willing to have in this city or this province, but it's a real issue. And we're never going to be able to get any kind of affordability if land prices continue to be through the roof, or land just isn't available. The next is materials. Materials is going to be harder. So we think of lumber and bathtubs and stuff like that. That one's going to be harder to push on. We do need to look at innovations to reduce material waste. Come up with new ways of doing things, new materials, to drive the cost down, to look at waste. We also need to look at reduction of taxes. There are still import taxes on certain products used in the home building sector that we actually don't make in Canada. We're not really protecting any domestic industry, but we're just putting taxes on it that make it more expensive. We need to have a conversation about that. Next is financing and services. So on the financing side, particularly on the apartment side, we are seeing some progress. We're seeing the federal government announce longer-term, lower-rate financing programs for purpose-built rental. This is really important. This access to capital piece is really important. But the biggest thing we often need is just faster, more predictable approvals processes to de-risk projects, to lower carrying costs, and reduce legal fees. So my friend Jennifer Keesmaat, who is on the Task Force for Housing and Climate, talks about this a lot, that they had one project, was ready to go, everything was okay, but they needed to get municipal approvals, which were delayed for several years. By the time they got those approvals, interest rates had gone up. That delay, just because of that interest rate change, cost them $65 million on a project. Because when they did the pro forma, interest rates were down here, but then after all the municipal delays, once they got ready to get started, interest rates were up here. So what that means is not only, because sometimes the rate changes work in your favor, sometimes they don't, but because you have to account for the potential of rate changes, that increases the risk of your project. And anybody, we had this sort of finance introduction. The higher the risk of a sector or the industry, the higher the rates of returns need to be. Because otherwise, why would you invest in apartment buildings? Why wouldn't you just go out and buy Government of Canada bonds, which are now yielding a higher interest rate than they were 3 years ago, right? So you're now competing with all of these asset classes that have much higher rate of return 3 years ago and are essentially zero risk. You're going to need higher returns in order to do that. So, and I don't think that's always well understood by our policymakers at the municipal level, that municipal delays, or provincial or federal delays for that matter, any kind of government delays increases the risk on a project, which then requires an increased rate of return to make that project viable. We need to de-risk the sector. And that doesn't mean just letting people do whatever the heck they want, but it's rather about having clear rules and consistency. So going into something, you know that you have a very good chance to getting to yes because you've done the things that you need to do, and that answer of yes comes relatively quickly. Things like the pre-approved catalog of designs can also help, both ensuring getting approvals for projects, but they can also kind of lower some of your costs as well. So that's an initiative that the CMHC is putting forward, but we're also seeing it out in British Columbia. The next is workers' salaries and benefits. And my dad was a sheet metal worker in housing. I'm not suggesting that we need to pay folks like my dad less, so I'm not suggesting for a moment we need to drive down the wages of trades workers. So just want to be very clear about that. But we do also have to recognize that skilled trade shortages will grow with retirements. My dad's 77, he's not working in the industry a lot more, but there's a lot of men and women 10 or 15 years younger than him who are still in the sector or who are about to retire. Immigrations and skills policies can help with that. Our immigration system is not great at bringing in skilled trade people. That for example, like our point system rewards things like having advanced degrees, having very good English or French skills. Our immigration system is basically biased towards bringing in guys like me, and is biased against bringing in guys like my dad. And I think we probably need fewer guys like me and more guys like my dad. And that's partly just me not wanting competition, but I do think we need to look at this. And yes, we have some specialized programs for the trades, but I think we need to start examining how our point system works. But the big thing is we need to increase productivity, right? We build home, like I can put my dad on a job site, and other than the fact that he doesn't have to plug in his tools, not much has changed since the 1970s. But we don't build cars or televisions or anything else like we have back then. We've also got to figure out how to get this sector to be less labor intensive. Right? We're not going to double home building by doubling the number of tradespeople. The math isn't going to work. We've got to find ways to be more innovative, more productive, looking at new methods. And that doesn't necessarily lower the cost, because those methods have a cost as well, but it allows us to do more with less. Next piece is margins, which this is probably not going to make me fan. I think the developers and builders were with me until this piece, but stay with me here. I think you might be okay with this. First of all, the dollar amounts of margins are likely to decrease as other costs decrease. If you deal with the other stuff, even if the percentage margin stays the same, the dollar amounts actually might go down. But in my view, where we should be looking on the margin side is to de-risk the sector, build competition. Again, it goes to my earlier point. One of the reasons why margins tend to be higher in this sector than other sectors is not necessarily because anyone is in one sector or is more or less greedy. It's just that there's more inherent risk in this sector, which drives up margins. If we can figure out how to de-risk this sector, if we can figure out how to drive more competition in home building, that's going to have an effect on margins. But if you think about it, like if we can also speed up the approvals processes, would you rather have an 8% margin on a project that took you 5 years, or a 10% margin on a project that took you 10 years? you actually, again, for the finance people in the room, do the math. You'd actually take the lower margin if you could build the thing, sell it, then do it again. You actually make more money by doing 2 things over 10 years than 1 thing over 10 years, right? So if we can figure out how to speed up this process, yeah, you might get some margin compression, but the builders and developers are actually better off in the long run because they can build, then reinvest that capital and go again and again and again and again, even if it compresses the margin on any particular project. So the more we can speed things up, the more that we can create certainty, we're going to see this slice of the pie shrink, but that's still going to create lots of opportunities for industry. And then finally, the tax piece. Oh boy, the tax piece. So again, different sides. So here on this example, just these 4 taxes, production taxes like your development charges and so on, your 2 sales taxes and your land transfer tax is about 21%. It can be higher than that depending on what you're building. We need to address that. We tax home building the same way we tax alcohol and cigarettes, and we wonder why consumption's falling. So taxes on home building are incredibly high in Ontario, leading to a lack of affordability. Give an example of this. When I bought my first home in London, Ontario, 20 years ago, development charge, just the one charge, was $5,000. Today it's $47,000, 820% increase. I can guarantee you salaries and wages have not gone up 820%. I don't make 820% more money than I did 20 years ago. That'd be really nice. But I don't. And we have to understand that there are ways of dealing with this. Now, on the tax side, we've had some very good measures from the federal government on the purpose-built rental side. So the first is the elimination of HST. So we had both the province and the federal government working together, eliminated the HST on building new apartment buildings, which is fantastic. The second is the reintroduction of the 10% accelerated capital cost allowance on apartment construction. So basically what that means is your depreciation rate for tax reasons on construction used to be 4% prior to this change. Now it's going up to 10%, which it was back in the 1960s when we built a lot of rental buildings. So on $100 million construction costs, what this means is before you could deduct $4 million in year 1 on your taxes, now you can deduct $10 million. That's going to get more apartments built. From the folks who I talked to in the sector, they tell me each of these basically gives them 50 to 75 basis points on a project. So if you had a project before with a rate of return of 10%, this raises it to the rate of return to about 11 to 11.5%, depending on the project, the model. So what this does is this creates, projects that were, close to a yes, it can push them over the line. Those marginal projects that didn't quite pencil out might now pencil out in this. Is it enough? No, but it's quite helpful, particularly on the rental side. But it doesn't really attack the ownership side. There's a lot more to do. And again, development charges are up, depending on the community, anywhere from 5 to 10x over the last 20 years. And we have to understand that we do need development charges. Right, development charges pay for a lot of things. So we need to, for instance, pay for, you've got new developments, you need new water and wastewater infrastructure. You have to pay for that, right? Like that's, there's no free lunch here. But there are alternative ways of doing it. So one of the ways that do it, which was recommended in Ford's Affordability Task Force, is to do it as a municipal services model. So basically, instead of putting the entire cost of building a wastewater plant onto development charges, and then having that extra $50,000 go into a home price, which then to pay it off, basically you're telling homeowners that they have to pay it off at mortgage rates, 5.5%, 6%. Instead, run it as a utility model where the utility is paying the debt on it, but it basically charges a monthly fee to those new residents. And this does a couple things. That first, now you're not pushing this all as an upfront cost, But secondly, because municipalities can borrow at a lower rate than households, instead of paying 5.5% or 6% interest on that new wastewater plant, you're now paying maybe 4% interest because the utility is paying the interest cost, not the homeowners. Now, the utility is obviously transferring those interest costs over to the users, but doing so at 4% rather than 6%. So we save money this way by changing how we pay for infrastructure. But we also, again, need to have a grown-up conversation about how we fund certain types of infrastructure. So, for example, City of Kitchener is building a fantastic new soccer facility, $144 million, FIFA-sized field, fantastic. I love soccer, big soccer fan. Almost all of that, all but about $15 million of that is going into development, from development charges. There's $15 million that they're getting for the feds in the province for this facility. The other $129 million is coming from development charges. This is a facility that the entire community is going to use, the entire community is going to enjoy. Why are we making a few thousand new homeowners pay for a facility that everybody's going to use? I don't think that's entirely fair. And furthermore, on this project, there was one of the city councilors touted this project and touted the financing model as saying, this is great because we can build a soccer stadium and taxpayers won't pay a dime. I'm sorry, that's not true. There are taxpayers who are going to pay for this an awful lot. We're just punting that cost onto a handful of taxpayers who are going to pay the entire freight, a handful of newcomers. I don't think that's entirely fair, and it's helping contribute to our lack of housing affordability. Now, there's no free lunch here. I like soccer facilities. I think we need more of them. But I think we need a fairer way to pay for them other than putting them onto new development. I think we need to have a reasonable conversation about, okay, what truly is infrastructure that is needed for new housing, and what's simply a nice to have that we're forcing newcomers to pay for when it's something that the entire community is going to enjoy. So the solutions are out there. They just need to be implemented. So I'll leave you with this, that the housing crisis is truly a crisis. This is an affordability issue, and I worry. I have a soon-to-be 13-year-old, and I've got a 9-year-old, and I don't know how they're ever going to be able to afford a home in Ottawa or, frankly, anywhere else in this province. And I see what my 22 and 23-year-old students who are going, they grow up in London, a GTA, they grow up in Ottawa, and they're saying, Mike, I can't make a go of it here. I'm going to have to move to Alberta. I'm going to have to move to the United States. I think that is deeply, deeply unfortunate. We can fix this. It is a solvable problem. We've been here before. At the end of World War II, we had a housing shortage, and we fixed it with a variety of policies, some of which we have recommended again in this blueprint. We had another housing shortage in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when all the baby boomers started to move out of their parents' house and needed somewhere to go. And we fixed that. We built apartment buildings. We built great suburbs. We built great places to live. We could do that again. It is possible, and frankly, it is in all of our interests. Yes, I'm a homeowner. I am here. Most of us, are not necessarily in the home, in the market for a home, but we have kids, or we would like to live somewhere where doctors and nurses and teachers and all of the people that make for a great community can afford to live here as well. So I'll leave you with that this is a solvable problem. We've been here before, we can solve it again, but it's going to take some political will, and it's going to take some pressure, some action from everybody in this room. So I'll leave it there. Happy to answer any questions or have any discussion you'd like.
I'm just going to open it up for questions. Do you have any questions for Dr. Moffatt?
It's fantastic. I answered them all.
I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
it's just an icebreaker type thing. I think
Sure.
There are many questions out there. Mike, you've made lots of recommendations to the federal government. They've implemented many of them. What's the next biggest thing they need to implement or change?
The next, from the federal government, I think we have to do more on both the land. Yeah, I guess three things. That this land piece is important. Where it could fall down is on the implementation, right? This is a big complex thing, and governments often struggle with big complex things. So that's the sort of implementation side. The second side, I think, is on the tax side. I think they've done a number of great things on the rental side, which is fantastic. On the home ownership side, not as much. I mean, some of the mortgage changes are helpful. I would really like them to have a deeper strategy on how to make ownership housing more cost effective. You know, really restore the dream of home ownership. I think is the second piece. And the third piece, again, I'd stress is the immigration piece, which is not a discussion of, you know, more newcomers, less newcomers, that kind of thing. You know, I really think that we need to re-examine our point system because I think there has been this bias in our point system away from blue-collar labor. And maybe that made sense in the 1990s. I don't know if it makes as much sense today. So those are my three things. Implement the land, you know, get moving on the land piece and really focus on the implementation. Get the cost of ownership housing down on the tax side, not just rental housing. And review the immigration system to allow more blue collar labor to build the homes that we need in this country.
Alternative.
Yeah, I do think we need to look at that, and it's easy. It's easy for me and fun too to beat up on the municipalities and say, oh, you know, why are they building all these soccer stadiums using development charges? They really do have a lack of tools, right? They really do have sort of a lack of options. So I do think we need to look through the financing options that particularly municipalities have to fund these things and have, again, I keep using this term, but a grown-up conversation about who does what. I find there's been, you know, there's a lot of finger pointing about who's been responsible for the housing crisis, how much should the federal government be weighing in on these issues. I think if we had a conversation going, okay, well, what do we actually expect of our federal government? What do we expect of our provinces? And what do we expect of our municipalities? And then furthermore, okay, when it comes to the municipalities in particular, what financing tools should they have available to do that? Because, you know, a lot of these costs have been downloaded onto our municipalities who don't really have the financing tools to be able to go them, so they have to kind of go cap in hand to other orders of government. To the point at which now, you know, you've got the federal government, you know, giving infrastructure money, $6 billion of infrastructure money to the municipalities, and the province, you know, kind of getting in the way, going, well, that's our job, that's not your job. So, you know, we've just got all of this squabbling and this sort of lack of tools for municipalities, which I think is harmful. You know, this is the type of crisis where we need kind of everybody rowing in the same direction, and they're really not right now. And I think it's causing all kinds of hardships. Yeah, and I think it's a great question, and I do think that this model that we've had of, you know, point by point by point rezoning does create a lot of winners and losers, and it is problematic. But at the same time, it's challenging because you have to be able to build somewhere, and if you don't upzone anywhere, you're going to make the situation worse. Like, we need to build somewhere. So I do think that's where we're getting into discussions where, you know, doing more as of right, building more kind of blanket upzoning, which I know, you know, is not always popular. but gets away from creating those kind of winners and losers. Because you're right, when you do have a sort of point by point system, then where you're doing a single lot at a time, then absolutely that single lot, you are going to see that upzone in value. So I think this is where you need to have, instead of having these things, doing these things one at a time, I think is where you needed to have these larger discussions about, okay, well, can we do entire areas, but also, what is that responsibility of greenfields? And a lot of that starts with having official plans that are realistic for population growth. And because I'm in Ottawa, I won't pick on your city, I'll pick on my hometown of London, Ontario. Our official plan is put together around 2017 or so, came into effect in 2021. 2020/2021. And the official plan said, okay, we need to make sure by provincial law that between upzoning and urban growth boundary that we have enough land to support 20 years of population growth, which they defined, even though the official plan didn't come into effect until 2021, the plan basically said, okay, we need to have enough land, both infill and green space, to support population growth from 2015 to 2035. Right. London's population today, in 2024, is larger than what the official plan says is going to be in 2035. We basically, had this official 20 years of land. We exhausted it in less than 3. Well, if you're doing that, then the only way you can support this population growth, if you're not allowing for the density, is this kind of point by point intensification, which pisses everybody off. And I can understand why people don't like it. It inherently feels like an unfair process. So a lot of it comes down to having better planning and having better forecasts of population growth, realistic forecasts of population growth. And this is an area where I'm hopeful that, I'm hopeful that we'll see movement from the provincial government, because they've committed to this, that the provincial government will be doing the population projections for communities rather than allowing communities to basically go hire a third-party consultant to give them whatever answer that consultant thinks is appropriate. We're not planning for population growth because we're not realistic. We haven't been realistic in this province for about a decade on how quickly our populations grow. I've seen official plans that use Mulroney-era immigration targets in their population forecasts, and then use those population forecasts to say, oh, we've got enough land and we've done enough upzoning. So a lot of it is just, it comes down to planning, and it comes down to making sure that our plans make sense, so we don't have to constantly be having these point-by-point upzoning battles, which just, builders don't like it, neighborhoods, nobody likes it, so let's find a way to be more realistic about this. Oh, way in the back. There's a microphone coming, at least I think there is. There we go.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Moffatt. That presentation, I think, can become a bestseller.
Thank you.
Governments tend to respond to a crisis, as they did with COVID. What is the point of no return on this issue, where it's no longer possible to recover from the gulping of tax dollars?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a challenge, because we can think of there being like 2 types of crises. Like, one is the kind where you get hit immediately. There's a storm, there's a big event, and sort of focuses mind. This is one of the other types of crisis, the kind of slow-moving, every day gets slightly worse, kind of boiling frog type crisis, where you can kind of convince yourself, like, oh, it's not getting worse, or, oh, well, once interest rates change or once this changes or that changes, we're going to get out of it. I do think at the federal level, we have seen the federal government treat it like a crisis. Now that might be more for political reasons than economic reasons. I'll leave that to the pollsters. All I know is that they're moving, and I'm happy that they're moving. Yeah, it is a challenge though, and I think it is going to be it's going to continue being a challenge because it's not the kind of area where there's going to be winners and losers. There's going to be debates, and it's not even clear, I think, even to experts, let alone the general public, about like who's driving the bus on this. Is this a federal issue, a provincial issue, a municipal issue? And the answer is it's a bit of all three. So I do worry. I worry a lot. I think in my mind, one of the eye-opening things for me, one of the things that I think should have really focused our attention was that out-migration from Ontario. But it for whatever reason, it hasn't made a dent. I've talked about this in the media and others, and people go, "Oh, okay, that's interesting, Mike." I'm like, no, I actually think that's a big deal. When you're losing your best and brightest, and they're moving out to Alberta or New Brunswick or wherever because they can't afford to be here, in my mind, that should be an existential crisis, but we're not viewing it that way. And maybe I'd be a better social scientist if I could figure out why and figure out how to do it. So, which is pessimistic, but I'll leave you with a point of optimism that I do feel like the conversation is different today than it was a year ago when I presented to this audience. So I feel like we're moving in the right direction. Maybe not as fast as I'd like, but I think we're finally starting to understand, or the general public and the discourse is finally understanding what a crisis we find ourselves in.
Thank you. You commented during your talk about the historically low interest rates, and that allowed many people to get into home ownership. With the transition of these fixed mortgages now going into the higher interest rate, what sort of impact is that going to have on housing in this country?
Well, it didn't make me happy this summer when I renewed. That is going to be a challenge. Now, historically, and this is not the first time we've experienced this, where interest rates went up a few hundred points over a few years, creating affordability challenges. And we know from past events that families will do whatever they can to stay in their home, right? That leaving their home is kind of the point of last resort. So, I'm not expecting a huge wave of personal bankruptcy. I'm not expecting a huge wave of people downsizing, like a U.S. 2008 type event. I don't see that happening. But the challenge is that how people kind of resolve this is by spending less on everything else. And the challenge from an economic point of view is that your spending is my income, right? Like if you're not buying things in my store, then I'm not making money. So I do worry that one of the challenges we'll see over the next 12 to 36 months, and arguably already experiencing, is relatively slow economic growth due to low consumer spending. Because again, all of those mortgage payments that people are making, that they're finding, after renewal, that, oh God, I'm paying an extra $1,500 a month. That's $1,500 a month that they're not spending or saving for their child's education or what have you. So yeah, it is problematic, and I don't think, again, I don't think a 2008 2009 U.S. style housing crisis is likely. Like I don't think it will manifest itself that way, but how it does manifest itself is in lower consumer spending and lower economic growth, because we're not out there spending, we're not out there investing, creating new businesses, and so on. So yeah, it's not good, and we keep hoping that interest rates are going to go down, but we're not really seeing it yet. Every time it looks like globally we've turned a corner, there's a U.S. inflation print, or something happens in the Middle East that jacks up the price of oil, and central banks around the world are having to keep rates where they are.
Hi, I have a question about family-friendly housing that you were talking about. When you look around the downtown core, a lot of buildings are going up, high-rises. They tend to be, 700 square feet. They tend to be smaller units, one-bedroom, bachelors. 15 years ago, when I was starting my family, I lived in a condo downtown, and I would have stayed downtown I love condo living. There just wasn't, we'd be looking for a 3-bedroom. I mean, they just don't build them. So I'm just wondering if you think that there will be more of that type of housing, those types of condos. We're hearing that they're not really profitable for developers. Do you see a change in that?
Yeah, I'm actually cautiously optimistic. I'm glad you answered that because I felt really gloomy after the last few questions. I keep giving negative answers. I am cautiously optimistic that we can start to see more 2 and 3-bedroom, mid-rise apartments and that kind of thing. And this is where it's going to get really wonky, and I apologize for that. But if you go to Europe, there's a lot of really great family-friendly apartment units here. And you go, okay, well, if they can build it, why can't we? And the answer is actually because of building code reasons. A lot of those great apartment buildings, there we go. Yeah, the single staircase nerds are like, yeah, single egress. Mike's going to talk about that. I think we are going to start to see movement on that because a lot of those buildings you can't build in Canada because of the requirement to have a second set of staircases. And it changes the design. It doesn't allow for airflow between, having airflow except if you're in a corner unit, that kind of thing. It just changes the geometry of the building, of the units that you can build in a building. That combination requiring 2 points of egress plus the requirement to every bedroom needs a window, which is a good requirement. Just doesn't, it's really hard to make the geometry work. We're starting to see in Canada jurisdictions legalize European-style apartment buildings. British Columbia is taking the lead on this. One of the recommendations we had in our blueprint report is basically adopt Sweden's rules, which allow for this as long as you put in other fire safety measures. Right, as long as the building, the cladding's made out of a certain material, you have, sprinklers and that kind of thing. In Sweden, you can build up to, I believe it's 16 stories with a single egress. And that the geometry of it allows for more family-friendly spaces. So, does that get us all of the way there? Maybe not, but that will be an interesting change. Starting to see it in the US. British Columbia is taking the lead on that. Ontario's a little bit behind. We'll have to see where that goes. I'm cautiously optimistic that will start to allow for more family-sized units. Okay.
Can we give Dr. Moffatt a big round of applause, please?